In this brief video, I review how to access the Oxford English Dictionary in the hope that you may use this reference material to help yourselves to think about how to access this idea of metaphor in everyday language. The first step is to visit the UNF main website. Here you can access the university's library website to access any of the materials that it maintains and makes available to you. Once here in our one search bar, we can type in the name of the text we're looking for. For our purposes here, it's the Oxford English Dictionary. We'll be returned a set of results here in the subsequent page. And here we want to click on the third one, the Oxford English Dictionary Electronic Resource. If you are off campus, you may be prompted to log in with your N number and your password. If you are on campus, however, you should be able to access this materials without any prompting. I log in here, and I will be taken to the home page for the Oxford English Dictionary, more commonly referred to as the OED. In many ways, just like a regular dictionary, you do have access here to its ability to give you definitions, but this is a more encompassing dictionary insofar as it traces out the record of any word you want to look up. Anything that's been written in the human English lexicon over the last, say, 1,300 years or so in recorded print is available here. And you can see how words have changed meaning or alternated meaning and gained some sort of different powers over the decades and centuries at times. I'm going to start with a pretty common word, one that we use pretty frequently. While we want to define metaphor as a comparison of two unlike things, not involving like or as, metaphor has a much more encompassing definition. It's a figure. It's a figure of speech where one thing has a power of itself put onto another thing. For example, if we were to explain that Saddam Hussein is a lot like Hitler, or we could say Saddam Hussein is Hitler. These are both figures, both ways of transferring ideas about one thing from a column to another thing. Is Saddam Hussein, or more appropriately, was Saddam Hussein Hitler? Well, by definition, no. They're two unlike things. But in making the statement Saddam Hussein is Hitler, or is the new Hitler, as was an argument in the 90s and 2000s, we get this idea that, in fact, he is Hitler. He is that exact evilness or that killingness associated with Hitler. And that's the power of metaphor. It transfers a fullness of identity from one concept to another concept. Here, made available to us in the Oxford English Dictionary, we get the word history, the true sense history. That's where the word etymology comes from. It's the idea of where a word comes from. These are normally pretty fascinating because we get to see connections among many words across many languages. So metaphor we can trace out to mean two different words. Meta, meaning over, and then we get this idea of phora, to carry. You might think of the word amphora, for example, or you might think of a wheelbarrow, something that actually literally carries. So carries meaning over. Below we find two different definitions of a metaphor. A figure of speech in which a name or descriptive word or phrase is transferred to an object or action different from, but not analogous to. Secondly, it's something regarded as representative or suggestive of something else, especially material emblem. In many ways, we might think about metaphor as a way of translating. They're both the same word. One is Greek, one is Latin. However, we're more commonly used to using the idea of translation than we are of metaphorizing. Let's try another word. For anyone who's a Harry Potter aficionado, you might appreciate the source of muggle. Muggle actually is a pretty historied word, a tail resembling that of a fish, something relating to a young woman or sweetheart, something to do with marijuana, apparently. And then also, more recently, J.K. Rowling's use of it, and we'll view the full entry here, of a person who possesses no magical powers. Well, that's pretty specific. In this one universe of however many books it is, you have this term used. However, in 2000, the News Tribune used that language to determine or to make clear to its readers that there was a comparison being made between this wizard-like ability people had versus people, a league of wizards. The fielding a team of muggles in a league of wizards, the Storm opened the season with 4 losses, or it's a sports metaphor here. The good players are wizards, the bad ones are like muggles. They have no powers to even compete with these magical wizards. We can even take a duller word, such as fast. We use this word pretty frequently as a verb meaning to go without food, or we see it compounded in breakfast, the idea of breaking a fast. We use it to talk about speed, with someone who might run fast, for example. And there are at least 8 definitions here that the Oxford English Dictionary susses out for us. And we can start with that one on the adjective. Historically, and dating back to 888 AD, we get this idea of firmness, of fixed in placeness, of fastening something down. You might think about tying something down. And you can look at the history of the word here through Old German, Old English, Old Saxon, Old High German. It keeps going all the way back, and we get this idea of fastness, to keep guard, to observe. So to fasten down, to fix firmly in place. And we can look at the length of this page. We can see how many different definitions are available to us. Something to do with sleep. We see it's obsolete in that use. Fast aground, fast ashore, fixed in that way. Of color, something that will not fade. So if it's color fast, for example, we see that more recently in 17th century and 20th century. We keep moving down until we find something that may be more familiar to us in the definition of speed. And we see here rapidity, rapid. Of action, motion, or progress, quick, swift. So an idea of furiousness, something that tells us about the speed of something. We see here that 1400 is the first known usage of that term, and we get the idea that, well, in 888 we were using fast to mean something about fastening. Now in 1400 we're using it to mean something about the speed of something. However, 600 years later we have both definitions still, and we use them, and our brains know when to use which one. However, we're able to use both of them at the same time if we want to. And in that way we have those metaphors available to us. I'm going to take this opportunity to switch over to our course Rubrics now, because I've asked you to take an example from the rubrics to find metaphors here. And many of you may be thinking, well, there's no metaphorical language here. It's just really boring boilerplate language. Well, in point of fact, these documents, these 6 rubrics, are laden with metaphors. For example, the descriptive rating. Artist, professional, expert, skilled craftsperson, apprentice craftsperson, novice. These are all metaphors. Your writing is not a craftsperson. You are not a craftsperson. But when I use that language, I bring over an entire metaphorical trope, an entire figure. I talk about something in terms of crafting. When you're writing a paper, do you ever think about doing paper mache? Or do you think about being a metallurgist or some sort of blacksmith? Well, that's kind of that same language, the idea of being an apprentice, of learning to do craftsmanship, craftspersonship in that way. And we get these different pieces of language in here as well. For example, elaborates. That's a pretty dull word. It's pretty common. To elaborate on something usually means to add on to, we might argue. If we go to the OED, for example, then we look at that same word, and we take its verb definition, and we look at it and say, where does the word elaborate come from? Does it look familiar at all? And it sort of does, actually. We see the word labor inside of it. So it's some sort of historical association with to produce by labor, to produce or develop by the application of labor, to fashion. And we return to this rubric for thesis and think about ourselves. Do you feel like you're laboring when you're coming up with an idea? Do you think about medical labor in terms of obstetrician or giving birth, or the idea of laboring to build something such as a metallurgist or blacksmith might? This is metaphorical language, and as you scroll through this document, you're going to see this language persists throughout these documents. Language by its very nature is coded so we understand it, and we use comparisons to make information more readily available to ourselves. So in this way, we try to transmit meaning. And as you scroll through, you will see a lot more language that may be coded in this way. For example, the idea of developing, the idea of transitioning, the idea of appropriateness. What do these words mean? I would urge you to look them up. I would urge you to think about how they overlap. What kind of trends do you see? Do you see any patterns of metaphors? Do you see any contradictions in metaphors? Do you see where the rubric fails and where it succeeds? These are the kinds of questions you want to ask yourself as you review the rubrics and as you try to find figurative language. I again promise you, these documents, this document of rubrics is complete with these materials, and you will find a bevy of information here. If you have any questions, though, feel free to email me. And as you find metaphors, if you want to, I've opened a discussion board in Blackboard where you can contribute your ideas and say, hey, I think I found a good metaphor. What do you think? Or if you're having trouble finding a good metaphor, maybe you can turn to that discussion board to look for some good ideas. Either way.